Okay, it's time to install MongoDB into our application. And if you've never used NoSQL or MongoDB before, there's a slight difference between this and a SQL Server or Postgres database. A SQL Server and Postgres, well, they're considered relational databases that have tables that can be related to each other, whereas a NoSQL database really just stores documents and doesn't have a defined schema such as a SQL Server or Postgres database. So each of our items is going to be stored as a document. In fact, let's begin with the geeky NoSQL joke. Let's say that 3 database admins walked into a NoSQL bar. A little while later, they walked out because they could not find a table. Boom, boom, tish. So basically, NoSQL doesn't use tables, is one way of explaining what a NoSQL database is. And we're going to go ahead and install MongoDB. We're going to get some help with the queries that we're going to pass to MongoDB with the package that we've installed, which is MongoDB entities. It makes it very easy for us to then query and update our MongoDB database. Also, what we're going to do is use Docker Compose to go and get and start our MongoDB server. So that's the approach that we're going to take. And we'll open up our Docker Compose file, and I've got Solution Explorer open. So let's just use the go-to file because that's not really part of our solution. It's more outside of our solution, just as a file at the root of the solution folder. So we're going to add a new service. This one's going to be called Mongo. And the image that we're going to be using is very simply named Mongo. And we need to pass this some environment variables for our username and password. Be careful with the spelling here because you're not going to get any type safety in these YAML files. And we need mongo underscore init db underscore root underscore username. And the value for this, we're just going to use root as the root user. And we'll use mongo underscore init db and root underscore password equals, and we'll just say Mongo PW. I'll stick with my recommendation not to use complex passwords whilst you're running these development services that we're simply using just to develop our application. There's little point in making life difficult for yourself with complex passwords at this stage. Now, MongoDB runs on port number 27017 by default. And that's the external port that we're going to access this on via Docker, but internally this is also going to run on 27017. So please make sure that these are identical, and then we'll give it a volume because it is a database and we want it to persist our data. So first of all, we'll give the volume a name, and this is referred to as a named volume. So when we did this earlier with PG Data, we effectively specified the named volume here so that when we run Docker Compose, then inside Docker, this effectively creates a volume where it reserves some space on our operating system. Now, testing this, it doesn't work as it's supposed to on my particular operating system on my computer. There are some variances with Docker. What this effectively gives me on a Mac, on a silicon chip, seems to be just an anonymous volume. And if I go to Docker and I hover over the delete for Postgres, in fact, let's click this because it gives us the description. And it tells us that this is selected for deletion. Any anonymous volumes associated with this container are also deleted. In my testing, I found that even if I'm using a named volume and I delete this, then I also lose all of the data as well. So the named volume doesn't seem to be storing any data on this version of Docker for my particular operating system. Your mileage may vary depending on which OS you're using, which version of Docker you're using, but for the sake of development of our application, these are not production database servers, and the data we're creating, we don't care if it gets wiped. If we shut down or remove or delete these images, and we recreate them again. We've got seed data, we can always get our data back very easily if we do delete them. So you may find a slight difference compared to what I'm saying versus what actually works on your machine. But in this case, I'm going to give it a named volume anyway, because it doesn't do any harm, it just doesn't work as it seems it's supposed to. And then I'm going to specify the location inside the Docker image as var lib mongodb/data. And even though, like I said, on my machine, it doesn't seem to make any difference, I'm just going to specify the named volume down here as well. So with that in place, we can now go ahead and run our Mongo database. So I'm just going to go to the terminal once again. I'm going to open up a new tab inside the terminal. We need to be at the solution level to run this command, and we don't need to stop Docker or change anything. We can simply run docker compose up with the -d switch, and this is going to go ahead, pull the MongoDB image down, and then it should start the database server. And once that's completed, then we should have the MongoDB started. And if we go and take a look at Docker, now I've got mine exited, which is interesting. I'm just going to run the docker compose up command once again. It says it started and it's immediately stopped. And what could be the problem with that? Well, let's take a look, because that caught me by surprise. I was expecting this to be working. And when I said be careful with spelling, this is why, because we've got an issue missing MongoDB init root username or MongoDB init root password. So I've made a mistake in the docker compose file, and let's take a look and see what I have done. There we go. Mongo init rather than init db, and that should resolve this problem. So let's just run docker compose up once again, and when I reconfigure the docker compose file, it's actually going to restart that database. So let's go take a look, and this time we have it up and running and we are successful. And if I click on this to check the logs, then we can see activity going on inside here. Gobbledygook, lots and lots of logs that we have for a MongoDB database. But what we can also do is add yet another extension into VS Code if we want to take a look inside our MongoDB database. And back to the extensions once again, and we can search for MongoDB, and we have one here, MongoDB for VS Code, and this will allow us to view the data inside our MongoDB database. So I'm going to go ahead and install this one. And once that has been installed, then we can make a connection to our new Shiny database server. So we can connect with a connection string, but it's kind of easier just to use the advanced connection settings and open the form. And the connection type is going to be standalone. The host name is localhost, port 27017. Authentication is going to be username and password, and that's root for the username and MongoPW for the password. We don't have an authentication database, so we should be able to connect, and we should see that we're successfully connected to localhost 27017. And if we take a look at the MongoDB down here, we can see our database that we are connected to. We've got a few default databases that are provided. We don't have our own data in there, but we have confirmed that we can connect to our new MongoDB server. Excellent. And now we have this in place. Next we'll take a look at creating the MongoDB entity that we need.